There's a lot of different factors that go into making any particular trial harder than others. But it all starts with tracking it. If you don't track that information, how do you know that, oh, we've learned over time that in this indication with this secondary indication in this phase, we tend to have drastically higher screen fails than the same exact indication, but a different phase. You would never know it if you didn't start by tracking that types of information.
Right. I'm here with Sean Rice. Sean is the CEO of Medical Research South, a clinical research site, and Medical Research Alliance, which is a network of independent clinical research sites. In addition, Sean is a co-founder of Divana Solutions, a software system that helps sites manage their business development pipelines. Now, before we begin, I do have one exciting announcement. Our company, Clinical Research IO, and Sean's company, Divana Solutions, are in the process of building an integration. Under this integration, Divana users will be able to send studies over into CRIO, and CRIO users will be able to send metrics back into Divana. We're coding it right now. We should have a lot more to say when we release this in first quarter of 2020. Great. So, Sean, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your site and your network.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Raymond. So I'm Sean Rice. I've been in the clinical research site space for about 10 years now. Medical Research South, we're a dedicated site or a group of sites based in Charleston, South Carolina. Been in business for about 20 years. Multi-therapy or multidiscipline, pediatric through geriatric, do most anything outside of oncology. Medical Research Alliance is a alliance or group of dedicated clinical research sites spread across the United States. So they all have a similar footprint or characteristics as I just outlined to Medical Research South. And the purpose of Medical Research Alliance is to provide a marketing umbrella for those sites to CROs and sponsors, where we're able to represent many sites to many sponsors and CROs with the goal of being able to streamline site selection process.
Got it. If you're a site and you're interested in joining, how do you join? Is it a closed network, invitation only, or do you submit an application?
It's really just reach out to me, and then from there it's a dialogue, but there is a vetting or screening process. We don't let just any site in. So if anyone's interested, it usually starts just with a simple outreach to myself and the dialogue.
Okay, got it. Good. So for audience members who are not familiar with Divana Solutions, you want to tell us a little about what Divana does and what your role has been in terms of creating that? Yeah,
absolutely. So Divana Solutions started as a highly customized business development tool, but since then it's actually evolved into a platform that is designed to manage the study startup process and tracking enrollment on trials, which as a result automatically tracks key metrics that most any CRO or sponsor in the industry would care about.
Got it. And that's a good segue to the topic of this webinar, which is the 5 metrics all site owners should track. I am going to share my screen now and pull up on the screen exactly what those 5 metrics are, and you're going to help walk us through it. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. Okay, so we've got the 5 metrics up on the screen. These are your metrics. This is what you're suggesting sites should track. So walk us through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do consider these 5 key metrics that any site should track. But to be honest, there's probably hundreds, maybe thousands of metrics. This is just to give you a baseline of what I think any CRO or sponsor would be interested in. But from there, it can really evolve into what's most important to your site from a sales standpoint, trying to win more trials, but also from an operational standpoint. What are you trying to really refine in terms of creating efficiency at your site? But to start, I mean, the first one is time from award to active. And what that simply means, or what that metric is from the time a site receives an award letter to the day that they're active screening patients or activated to screen patients. Obviously, that metric is captured by a count of days. And it's important because if you track, say you get an award letter today to the day that you're activated to start screening patients, you can then start to hone in on your efficiency of startup. So as most people involved in the site space know, there's many components that go into startup. But everybody agrees from the time you're awarded the trial to the time that you're activated, trying to minimize that or compress that timeline only speeds up the entire trial, because once you start screening and once you hit your randomization targets across the trial, everything else is sort of lock in step, if you will. The protocols are, very much defined in terms of how long they are, how many study visits. The huge variable is the ability to get up in screening as quickly as possible. So once again, you track that for every study opportunity. If you're able to track it by therapeutic area or indication, and also by CRO or sponsor, you can sort of further segment into some of the stats. How does it vary by indication? How does it vary by CRO or sponsor? And once again, you can look at those and try to figure out or identify what's causing my bottlenecks. What can I do to improve my efficiency in those areas?
Right. I like this, but it strikes me that a lot of the variability could be outside the site's control, though, right? Because a lot of it could be delays from the sponsor or CRO or the EDC vendor or whatever.
That's correct. There's many components. So you don't want just the absolute number, meaning the number of days from award to active. You want the granular detail. So usually the largest amount of time in startup is consumed in contracting budgeting. And on average, you'll find that I think most CROs, they're looking for less than 100 days in terms of contracted budgeting. What's interesting, though, is most professional sites, they turn around contracts and budgets very quickly. Meaning, if I was to receive a contract and budget today, it's highly likely that contract and budget comments are going to be returned in a couple business days, maybe 5 at tops. So how do you get to these large numbers in terms of the total time to get from an initial contract and budget to something that's executed? And what you'll find is usually it's largely on the CRO and sponsor side. So you want to track all of this. So when they start to look at how long it takes you to get activated, how much is actually on your site, Raymond, versus how much is on your CRO or sponsor partner? Because you can only control one piece of the puzzle.
Got it.
You have to work as a team to make sure that these trials start up faster.
Right. So this can actually break down into other metrics, such as time from receipt of contract to turnaround time on your end to return the contract, for instance.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And once again, that's key as to, how quickly are you starting up? Because if you don't like the metrics, how much of the metrics are on you versus, the customer or partner that you're working with. And once again, if you're not tracking it, it's on you to be proactive to make them better. Meaning, okay, I turned around my initial comments on this contract and budget 5 days ago, but if I'm not tracking that and actively following up with my contact, it's just as much on me as it is on them for it not moving forward faster.
Right. And I can see this actually being helpful from a planning perspective, because if you got a study on a certain day, if you at least had an idea of when you're actually going to start screening, you now have some forecast from when patients will come in, when you need to be staffed up. It can help with your hiring and onboarding. I could see it being a very useful forecasting tool, just overall planning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's sort of the evolution of Devana as a company and as a solution, meaning it really did start very much as a tool to help with our business development efforts. But from there, and to the point you just touched on, we saw that the reach or the application was so much greater. And particularly, once again, how do we make sure that we're starting as efficiently as possible? But being able to do that and execute also requires us to plan our internal resources accordingly and appropriately. So once again, without a tool, it makes it really difficult. It becomes a lot of stuff that's in your head that, if it all stays there and you execute on it, that's great. But for most of us, there's only so much we can retain. So having something that we can rely on to help tell us what we need to do and when we need to do it is key.
Got it. Okay, good. So next one is active to screening.
Yep. And that really builds on one of your points from the previous metric, which active is from the time that your site's activated to screen patients to the first day that you actually have a subject that's comes in for screening. And how I would tie that into your previous point or comment is once your site's active, the variables that you can control are more so on the site's end as opposed to being controlled by outside sources. So what's key is obviously if you, for instance, were activated on a study today, you want to get that first patient screened as quickly as possible. And what that really shows or highlights to a CRO or sponsor is, aside from the fact that the site was able to mobilize quickly, they clearly had a plan of action. So by the time that we activated them, that wasn't when they were turning on the faucet, if you will. They already had their patients identified, ready to go, and were on the schedule. Which, needless to say, getting them on the schedule, getting them screened is the first step to getting them randomized. Getting them randomized is what we're all after in terms of getting the required number of patients in the trial overall.
Got it. Okay, great. And the next one, number 3?
Contract met by indication percentage. And what this means is for every trial that you take, there is an associated number of patients that you're contracted for. So on average, what percentage are you actually fulfilling your contract? And you can look at that in total. You can look at that by therapeutic area. You can look at it by investigator, by CRO, by sponsor, by a whole lot of different ways. But this goes back to the sort of the old saying that, past performance might not guarantee future performance, but it definitely gives you an indication of what a site's capable of. So the way you calculate this is, to use a simple example, if you had a contract for 10 patients in a trial and you were able to randomize 12 patients, your contract met percentage for that particular indication on that trial would be 120%.
Got it.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, is this usually in the contract itself? Is it actually specified, or is it sort of implied in the budget, or where is this actually held and who comes up with this number?
Great question. So sometimes you will find that in your contract, but not always. Most trials these days, they're competitive enrollment. So while there's an expectation of how many trials your site will screen and randomize, ideally, as long as you're keeping high quality data while ensuring patient safety, they're going to allow you to continue to screen and randomize more. But I would suggest, as a best practice, as part of your contracting process, it is important to try to get that number in your contract.
I see.
And the reason being, if you don't have it in the contract, who's to hold you accountable as to what you said you were going to do relative to what you actually did? So in your mind, you may have been a top performer on this trial because you, building off the past example, put 20 patients in it. Well, if there's no number that you were expected to put in it, who's to say 20 was fantastic or 20 was behind other sites on the trial? It's hard to say. So at least by doing that, it gives you a tangible touch point that you can tie your performance to.
So you're suggesting if the contract that you get from the sponsor doesn't actually have a target number in there, that a site should proactively enter that?
Yeah, I definitely would suggest that. Obviously, I don't think it's ever going to change because it, in my experience, hasn't, meaning that it's still competitive.
Right.
If for some reason they're worried about that, by all means, make sure the language remains that, hey, this is our number, but it's still competitive enrollment as long as we're meeting all the objectives, as mentioned, quality data, patient safety, that we can go above and beyond it. But
right.
It is worth pushing. And a lot of times it's tied to other stuff within your contract. So, I mean, screen fail reimbursements sometimes are tied to the number of randomized patients. You can add in additional language that if you hit certain thresholds that you get better screen fail reimbursements. So there really isn't a lot of negative to it, short of you not actually achieving the number of patients you want for that trial.
Got it. And why an absolute target as opposed to I'm above or below the average, or I was in the top quartile, or something relative. Because sometimes you have protocols that are just harder than everyone expected. And so nobody's hitting their target. But if you do relatively well, you're actually doing okay. Is there any room for relative metrics?
Yeah, there definitely is. And to your point, that's a little harder to come by because it's not dependent only on your site's performance, but each and every site within that particular trial's performance. So to get to that type of information, I definitely encourage sites to be proactive with their CRAs, their project managers on studies, and just ask direct questions. Instead of just the global enrollment as a total number, where does our site stand?
Right.
And you don't necessarily need to know where other sites stand, but to your point, if you know where you stand relative to them on that trial, that helps to provide a little more clarity as to, protocols that perhaps are easier, or to your point, protocols that maybe are just more difficult.
Right, right. Sometimes the sponsors will actually just tell you. They'll actually give you the ranking. They'll tell you every single PI and how many people are enrolled.
Yep.
They'll be very transparent about it. Other times they might tell you how many sites, and you know what the global enrollment number is, so you can divide it and say, hey, simplistically, here's the average number, right, mathematically.
Yep.
Do you think in your feasibility questionnaires you can refer to relative metrics like that and say, look, I was in the top quartile, or look, here's a sanitized actual, graph that I got from the sponsor, and this is our bar? I mean, have you seen that being used in feasibilities?
Yeah, I definitely have. And that's a great point because your ability to sell your site or your capabilities on the feasibility is 100% dependent on the information, the metrics you keep on your site's performance. So if it's absolute performance against a contract number, that's one thing. If it's we're in the top quartile or we were the top enroller in this trial, get tangible proof of it and make sure it's something that's easily accessible that you can weave into your feasibility, your PSV, the entire sales process. Because without that information, it's simply you going on memory. But being able to hand over something that's tangible to a CRO or sponsor, it just further elevates your site in terms of their potential for selecting you.
Yeah, it seems like if you had both an absolute number and a relative number, you've got the best of both metrics. You can pick the one and go forward with the one that puts the best light on your site, its performance.
Absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah, good. All right, number 4, patients completed, screened, and enrolled.
Okay, so this one, as the title implies, is probably pretty straightforward, but the number of patients completed, screened, and enrolled by trial, but you also want to track it obviously by indication. If you want to, you could do by secondary indication. For instance, diabetes, that would be your primary, but there's a number of secondary indications that could be tied to a diabetes trial. And ultimately, number of patients enrolled. And your goal here is to use this metric to tie it together with some of the previous metrics, meaning if you're starting up quickly, that's great. Obviously, that's what we want to see. If you're consistently achieving what your expectations were for a trial in terms of enrollment, even better. You're building your case. But then you're starting with this metric to say, in absolute terms, this is the number of patients that we put through trials in this particular indication. This number of screened, this is the number of enrolled. So then you already have, if you don't show it to them, you've already showed an implied screen fail ratio, which is a good thing because you're going to have that conversation as part of a site selection process that how many patients do you expect or need to get for this trial and what's your expected screen fail rate? Well, your knowledge of a particular indication or therapeutic area from your past experience should already give you an indication of what the average screen fail rate could be. And then you can start to use that information. What are the differences in this trial that may make that screen fail ratio lower, higher, whichever. But when you tie it all together, really what you're doing as part of that sales process, if you will, is you're really reflecting your site's ability to track information and understand its capabilities relative to whatever the CRO or sponsor's needs are on this particular trial. And it's little things like that on highly competitive trials that usually allow sites to put themselves or stand out from the pack.
Yeah, yeah. These numbers can vary quite a bit, though. Even within an indication, you could have extremely stringent eligibility criteria, and it's just you have a high screen failure rate, or it could be a trial where if you randomize 2, you're actually in pretty good shape.
Yep.
But the same indication with easier criteria could be randomizing 10 in the exact same patient population. So how do you normalize for relative protocol difficulty a number like this?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because obviously it's a high level number right now, but you need the underlying granularity to be able to dig into it for any particular, whether it's a sponsor, CRO, a particular trial indication, maybe it's a phase. There's a lot of different factors that go into making any particular trial harder than others. But it all starts with tracking it. If you don't track that information, how do you know that, oh, we've learned over time that in this indication with this secondary indication in this phase, we tend to have drastically higher screen fails than the same exact indication, but a different phase? You would never know it if you didn't start by tracking that types of information.
Right. So you have the baseline, the database, you can at least start asking the questions and start drawing the correlations. Got it. Good. And then number 5, studies and indication. That's a raw count of the number of studies done by the PI.
Raw count, but sort of building off the last point that we just made, it's also tracking the underlying granularity to that detail or that data. Like number of studies and indication is a baseline. It's a big number, which if used correctly can just simply further validate that the investigator that you're putting forth for a trial opportunity has a lot of past experience in that particular indication. So as such, they probably have learned from past mistakes and are less likely to make similar ones. Just the same, they understand the pitfalls of particular trial protocols in an indication or therapeutic area, and they're more keen to look for those pitfalls during a PSV, which from there, it really helps them make the judgment call. If selected, is this the right trial for us? Knowing from our past experience, can we properly execute on this trial? And or if they can, and using some of the past metrics we've discussed today, how do I refine my expectations from a patient screening and enrollment standpoint? So I can have realistic projections about what we can do on this, because I think you made the point earlier, Raymond, I need to be able to staff for it accordingly. But also from the financial perspective, I need to make sure that this trial meets our financial expectations or goals, so it's worth our time. And then just as importantly, you want to be able to give your CRO and sponsor partner realistic expectations about what you're capable of. So they can rely on, if you're selected for this or this particular trial, you're going to reach the number of patients that you said you were. But I guess build on your initial question or point, it's very important to capture the underlying detail of these particular trials, because I think we've made it very clear during this conversation that all trials are not created equal. So the only way you know that's if you're tracking not just, our doctor's done 100 trials in type 2 diabetes. He's done 100 trials in type 2 diabetes in what secondary indications, with what sponsors, with what CROs, what phases.
Right.
So over time, you can start to really drill into the granularity of it and start to figure out, where do we really excel and where are we maybe have more trouble? And if we have more trouble, is it something that we can focus on and get better at? Or is it something that's inherent that, it's probably not worth our time to continue to focus there, because we've always had in our head that we're really, really strong in that particular area. The underlying data is telling you you're not. And once you've dug into it, you start to realize that, we're not, for reasons that we can't easily change. So once again, without that type of information, you really don't know how to refine or focus your efforts to, once again, try to make sure that your site's being considered for all trials that you're a really strong fit for. But just the same, you're not pushing yourself into trials where, based on historical experience that you've tracked, as much as I thought we were good at it, we're probably not the best fit. We should probably not take on that trial.
Right. Yeah. So what I like about this is you've distilled it down to 5 high-level metrics, but each one of those starts to ask a series of questions, or there's a bunch of analysis or insights that you can gain when you sort of peel back the onion and start looking at what's driving the differences across trials, either across indications or even within indication across trials. And I guess this process of a site or self-discovering what they're good at, I'm assuming that would then lead the site to say, okay, I'm very good at this, or this is my particular niche. And now the site says, okay, now I know exactly where to focus my business development efforts and how to make my case to the CRO when I approach them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you consistently track these types of metrics, both for your historical trials, but your trials that are ongoing and future ones, you start to gain really valuable insights that you can use for your own operational efficiencies. Meaning, I'd like to think that all sites, if they had the right information, would like to be able to improve on their ability to select the right trials, to start up quickly, to enroll patients. So by tracking all this, you can start to create benchmarks for your site. Meaning, for example, in 2019, our average startup time was, or days from award to active, was this number of days. We want to reduce it by 5%. That's a site or company goal of ours for 2020. Well, now you have an actionable metric that you can tie to your site. You can speak to it, communicate it throughout your organization, whether it's investigators, it's your clinical staff, and you can actually start to really set goals. And like anything, if you start to tie actual numbers or goals to something and you present it to everyone, just by the fact that you're talking about it, you're going to start to see improvement.
Right.
And as you see improvement, obviously that's going to be good for your site, but you just created another thing that you can sell to CROs and sponsors. Well, we were at this percentage last year and we reduced it by 5%. Our goal is to improve upon it by this percentage each year. And using that as part of the sales process, once again, only reiterates that this is a professional site that's well run, that is very, very focused on trying to be as efficient as possible, which I got to imagine from most CRO and sponsor standpoints, those are the type of characteristics I'd like to see in any site that they would work with on a study.
Yeah, gotcha. Good. All right, terrific. So last question. I think you made a very articulate case for these metrics and the why for the metrics and how to calculate and define them. Do you have any suggestions on or any best practice or tips on how to actually calculate it? Because is it, over time, or do you look for trend lines, or do you report in averages or medians, or any kind of, I thought you had some pretty good tips in that on some of the methodologies you can use.
Yeah. So, obviously, one, you just want to start by tracking it, because from there, that allows you to refine that information. What I would suggest as a best practice, once you start to build best practices of tracking your information, you want to look at trends. And trends, you can decide what makes the most sense for your particular site or your organization, but usually trends over a 18-month or a 24-month time period, those are usually good timelines, because you want enough space between what you're looking at to sort of be able to remove the noise, if you will. Because from time to time, month to month, you're going to have trials, or you're going to have metrics that either are artificially inflated for some of the points that we mentioned today, or maybe they're depressed. But if you start to look over, say, like I said, 18, 24-month time period, you should start to see normalization of these metrics. And from there, you can start to more easily set benchmarks of, okay, over this period, we were at this percentage. We want to start to see improvement over the next period of whatever percent you deem to be an effective or reasonable goal. So I would most definitely recommend over a period of time, as opposed to over your entire history or some other point in time.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much, Sean. Very, very informative. Helpful for sites to keep in mind the importance of these metrics. And as I mentioned before, CRIO and Devana, we are working on the integration, so hopefully we'll have another webcast about that. Thanks, Sean.
Yep. Thanks so much, Raymond.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Good. All right. I think we'll add it. Cool.